All right, everybody, welcome back to the channel. Neil Wintereg here with Matterhorn Business Development, and today we are joined by Ashly Guernaccini. She is an attorney. She's been on the channel before, so welcome back, Ashly.
Thank you very much.
And as always, I want to give a shout out to our channel partners, Metapulse. Go to metapulse.com, and you will be able to get like a business management setup for your organizational chart, your knowledge center, your statistics, etc., which is what we run all of our clients through, and we run Matterhorn with as well. And they are channel sponsors, so please go over there, check them out. But today, I've got Ashly on because we are here to talk about succession planning for businesses. I don't know if that's the correct wording, or if it would be business planning succession, or
You can really say it either way, but exactly what you said was totally fine.
Okay, good. I don't know if there's a special legal terminology for this stuff, so but for those of you who aren't familiar with Ashly, she is a local attorney here where we are in Clearwater, Florida. She is our attorney whenever we need anything. Ashly's who I go to. Whether it's estate planning, business planning, trademarks. Ashly does all these types of things. And the name of her law firm is At Cause Law. And you won't be able to see them on the live stream, although I did ask. Their two mascots, the Golden Retrievers, are usually running around and creating havoc. So we won't get to meet them this time. I'm going to try and convince Ashly to bring them in for the next live stream, and everybody will enjoy that. But today, Ashly, tell us just a little bit about who you are, who At Cause Law is, etc., and then we'll dive into succession for business.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'm the managing partner at the firm, as you said, At Cause Law Office. And I started out many, many moons ago doing a little bit of estate planning work. And then I quickly transitioned into business law, which I did for years and years and years, things like mergers and acquisitions, all types of intellectual property law. You mentioned trademarks, contracts, HR stuff. I always kind of kept that passion though for estate planning. So when I opened my own firm in 2020 in Florida, we were able to not only have a fairly large business practice, but we got to add on estate planning and probate relatively quickly. And the great thing about business succession planning is it can oftentimes be a combination between the business stuff, which we love to do here, as well as it has some estate planning aspects, because this is a plan that could easily affect your heirs or other people who are involved in your life that might be part of your estate planning.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I never really thought of this as a topic until, unfortunately, my father passed away last year. Then you start to realize there's all sorts of nuances and ins and outs about business ownership and estate planning and how it all works. And, I kind of realized, wow, this is something that people really don't pay any attention to, and don't realize that, by not having a spouse connected to the business in any way, if you pass on, the business is kind of locked out from your family ever being able to really take advantage of or use or keep open, and it creates a lot of problems. So it's something that I've become more aware of, especially after talking with you and putting together estate planning and business planning and stuff that we've had to do. That's why we decided that we should probably talk about this today. So how about, in a nutshell, we just break down, okay, what is succession as it applies to a business? And probably you'll have to go into a little bit of how it applies to a normal person, not, let's say, not a business anyway, or their personal life. But what does this mean, succession planning? How does it work? What's the basic of the subject?
Yeah, of course. That's a great place to start. So any good business succession plan is basically just going to set up what is going to happen to your business, who's going to take it over, is it going to be sold, or basically what is the plan if you become disabled, incapacitated, or eventually all of us at one point in time are going to die, right? So what's going to happen to this business? And it puts together all the pieces, or it should if it's done successfully, right? Puts together all the pieces so that there can be a relatively smooth, it should be as smooth as possible, transition from you as an owner back into the hands of the company if it's a very large company. Or I kind of like how you just brought up sort of the scenario where say you have a spouse who starts a company and they're a single member, they're the only owner of that company, which
Yeah,
often
let's say for you and I were talking on the phone about this. Let's say Neil has an auto body shop or a dry cleaning business, something that's kind of specific, but not not like a lawyer or a doctor's office where there's probably all kinds of other legalities that get into it. But let's say I have a dry cleaning business or an auto body shop or something like that, and I do all of the work, and then I unfortunately pass away, and my business is just sort of left there without anybody from my family being able to take money out of the bank account or do anything with. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is definitely one scenario that we see a lot where succession planning would really help. And it's interesting because, oftentimes there may be reasons when a sole proprietor or a solo person starting a business would want to maybe start out as, say, a single member LLC or a sole proprietor. There can be tax advantages for doing it that way. It also keeps things very simplistic. It can keep a lot of your paperwork, administrative type duties down. You don't have to have a huge overhead, big payroll. So there are some benefits, but one of the major drawbacks, and unfortunately, I have seen this over and over again, is if you are, let's take example, the sole member or single member LLC, if you are the only person listed as the owner of the business, well, that's an asset. It belongs to you. And then if something happens to you and there wasn't a proper succession plan in place, then there's a good chance that your family either risks maybe just losing the business, shutting it down, depending on whether it's really worth it to them or not to go through the probate process in order to actually have the asset passed along to an heir or to a beneficiary if there was a will. When really a lot of this can be prevented if you just sort of think early on who you would want to run your business. I mean, even in the event if you want to retire, it doesn't even have to always be thinking about death, but it's just always good to have a backup plan, because then there's actually fairly simple things that we can put in place, right? That we can document that would make it so that if anything happened to you, or if you did just want to easily transfer the business over, it can be done without any problems and without a lot of stress.
So let's do a scenario of, okay, I have this dry cleaning business and, you know, I set it up so that in the unfortunate event something happens where I pass on sooner than I think or whatever, right? I said, okay, my son is going to have this business. And so one day, car accident, whatever it is, something happens, I pass away. That next day, basically, my son would be the succession plan and he would retain ownership of that business. It would pass to him. We'll say Neil Jr. So now Neil Jr. owns this dry cleaning business. Now you might think, well, Neil Jr. has nothing to do with dry cleaning. He doesn't work in the business. He doesn't want the business. Well, why would I leave it to him? Well, maybe now Neil Jr. can sell that business and recoup some of the money and have some of that money because that's what you wanted to leave to Neil Jr. You'd be able to do that. It's not like it'd be a burden, or I mean, it could be, but I mean, it's kind of like it at least is an asset that passes on at that point. Whereas if I'm a single member LLC and I have a family and I pass away, now my family has no access to the business. Is that correct?
That's definitely correct. And this is kind of where the estate planning aspect comes into play with the business succession plan. Because basically, the way it works in estate planning, if somebody owns an asset, and I don't care what it could be a simple checking account, or we can be talking about a business or a home. If they own it in their name only, and they don't add anybody else to it, whether it's the business or the house, when something happens to them before that business or home or even checking account can pass along to their heir or their, whether it's their son, their wife, whoever it is, before that transition can occur, at least in the state of Florida, you have to go through the probate process, which is where a judge basically has to look at everything and
Yep.
determine who's taking it, who gets it under law, and then they have to sign off on it before the person actually gets it. So this is where they kind of go hand in hand, where it's really important to have this plan written out, but it's also very important as we maybe get a little older in age, or we realize the business is growing, so maybe it's more of a benefit to add somebody onto the business, even if that means doing an extra tax return, right?
Yep.
Versus staying sole member to get the benefit of doing just regular taxes on your own personal income tax forms.
Yep.
Once the business gets to a certain size, you're not going to really want to do that anyway, right? So
Right.
it would be beneficial, especially at that time, potentially to add a person onto the business, or where estate planning comes in, if you have a proper estate plan done, and as part of that, you can have a revocable trust, the business can be owned in there too. These are all ways that it could just pass directly, like in your example, to your son without needing to get that messy and long court approval before it does.
Right, because if I pass away and it's not really set up properly, then it has to go through probate and it has to go through all these areas. And by the time it does all that, the bank accounts will probably be liquidated out, or, and the business has been basically closed for 6 months or a year after you pass, because nothing's allowed to happen. So by the time it would end up with Neil Jr., there's no bank accounts, there's no more clientele because it's been closed. And, there's probably even outstanding rent and bills and debt attached to it now or something like that.
Sure. And you brought up a really great point. One of the biggest reasons to do succession planning is if you have a business that it's your passion and you pour your heart and soul into it, and you have clients who trust you, and you've built up goodwill in the community, and you have ongoing contracts, the last thing you want is for this thing that you created and you've made your own and you take so much pride in to just kind of fall by the wayside because there wasn't a proper setup for somebody else who can take over and fill in the gaps if anything happens to you. And I mean, some of this can be as simple as even having somebody, a key employee, or somebody in management on your team, and there's some kind of a document drawn up that states what they can do in the interim if something happens to you. Even if it means that you have to give them some kind of permission, either through a power of attorney or other instruments, so they can get into your bank accounts, or they can just kind of, help with the contracts, making sure they remain in place with your current clients. These things are really important because if you think about it, especially if you're a one-man show, if you're not around or you're not able to do these things, it's literally just like everything stops. And then not only is it sad and a mess because your legacy is kind of falling out, you also have all these potentially disgruntled customers who may have paid for services or who are currently on a contract and are expecting service.
Right. No, that makes total sense. Now, you had mentioned something earlier from a personal perspective. You said, all of your bank accounts, you should have your spouse on all of your bank accounts, so that in the event of something happening, that money, those accounts just transfer straight over to your spouse. It avoids the probate process. It avoids that basically becomes an asset that your family can now have that is not going to be touched or taken into account with the rest of the other death proceedings and all that kind of stuff. So that's obviously one thing that everybody should be able to do, is make sure that you have your spouse on all of your accounts and all that type of a thing, right? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yes, that's a really good point. And for people out there who, there's obviously some people who really do like at least keeping one account individual, or some people who just like separating it totally and don't love this idea of a joint account. That's fine too. And I know you know about this as well, Neil, but if you're really dead set on having individual accounts, then you got to go into your bank and you have to get the beneficiary designation form. They call it different things in different banks. It might be a POD form for payable on death, or a TOD for transferable on death, but it's a way that you can list a beneficiary on your account. So if you're totally unwilling to have joint ownership, you at least list a beneficiary. And then just like a life insurance policy that has a beneficiary, if something happens to you, that money in that account does not have to go through probate. It goes to the beneficiary.
Interesting. So I could still have my separate accounts from a spouse if you're ever, there's people that are out there that are concerned about having them joint, but you could have your spouse listed as the transfer or the beneficiary or whatever it is, and it would act as the same way, but they wouldn't be able to access your accounts while you were alive. So it's not like they'd be able to come in and
Exactly.
take money out and all that kind of stuff. So you'd keep it separate, but you list a spouse as a beneficiary or your son or whoever it is, your family member, so that if something did happen, they're automatically the beneficiary, and that then is separated out from the probate and all the other stuff.
Yes, if there's a beneficiary on it, does not have to go through probate.
Very interesting. Okay, cool. That's good to know. Now, that's personal side. Business side. Okay, to me, when I learned that, when you told me that, when we first met, that, hey, if it's a joint account and somebody passes on, it automatically goes through. There's no question. It's just like, boom, that's this person's money now. This is this person's asset now. That was like, oh, that's like really easy, and now you just tell me here, okay, now we have a beneficiary where you can still have it separate, but you can still have something there. Now, that's like super mind-blowingly easy for a personal thing. What would you say from the business side? What's the equivalent of that to the business side? Can you put a spouse on your bank accounts if they're not on your LLC and they would be able to have access to that money, or is that something completely different?
Yeah, so normally with the businesses, we more commonly see that the accounts would list, say, a trust as a beneficiary.
Okay.
But you can list beneficiaries on business bank accounts. The
Mhm.
other thing to consider with businesses, and I didn't mention this earlier because we were kind of talking about smaller businesses or especially
Yeah,
like
yeah.
sole owners, right? Um, it's going to be different for different companies. For example,
Okay.
large companies often already have built into either their shareholder agreement or buy sell agreement or an LLC operating agreement what happens if one of the owners becomes disabled or incapacitated or dies, what happens to their interest in the business. There's typically lots of provisions in there that usually involve the company buying back the interest. We
So
see
in
this
this case, let's say my dry cleaning business is massive. I'm statewide now and I've got a partner. Okay. So I've got my dry cleaning business. I expanded from my solo thing to a statewide dry cleaning business, and I've got another partner, and it's just me and the partner, and then obviously all of our employees and our staff and all that kind of stuff. But from a management perspective, let's say my spouse doesn't have anything to do with the business, right? She's not, right? Doesn't have anything to do with the business. Just it's me and my partner, all that kind of stuff. There should be agreements in place that if one of us, me or my partner, had something happen, I would buy my partner's stock from his spouse, and he would buy my stock from my spouse because my spouse is like, I don't want to do anything with a dry cleaning
yeah.
business. So in that case, would that just be language in the agreement, or would my spouse be on my ownership stocks, or like how does that work?
So that's a great question. So yes, to the first thing that you said, as far as the agreement, it can literally be as simple as being language in the agreement.
Okay.
And the language, a lot of times, this is not 100% of the time, but a lot of times spouses either one don't want to be involved in the business, they're not involved in the business, not to mention the other owners of the business, they went into business with one spouse, not the other one. So they
Right.
don't necessarily want a surviving spouse involved in the business either. So there's actually an easy way to handle that within the documents themselves, whether it's an LLC operating agreement or the shareholder agreement, where you can have provisions written in there that explain what happens, if somebody does die and they're married, what happens, kind of just like you said. So the company buys this person's shares. So the amount for the shares can go to the spouse versus the spouse just inheriting the stock and
Okay.
then also run, or the shares, whatever membership interest, in running the company. So there's a whole section that you can say, like, this is just what happens. There's no option, right? Like, if this happens,
Yeah.
we all agree that the company is going to buy out, right, the shares or the membership interest from the other spouse. And then additionally, it's very, very, very important to include language about the exact methodology behind the buyout. Like, how are you going to value the membership interest or the shares? It is so much easier if you have that agreement up front and it's written into your agreement versus you not being specific about it and then this thing being held up for years in court because everyone's arguing over how to value the interest.
Right. It says I'd buy them from you, but it doesn't say when I have to buy it from you. It doesn't say when I have to pay you. It doesn't say how much I'm paying you. So all of that should be figured out beforehand anything like that happens. Now, and then I also imagine the agreement would specify that that money for the value is going to that spouse specifically, like a name, meaning it's not part of the estate of that person. It's part of it, that this isn't Neil's money, it's Neil's spouse's money, and it's totally separate. Or that is that correct?
Yeah, anytime the agreement would list the payout goes to the estate, then we're back into the situation where that payout goes through probate. So that's why we commonly do in these agreements see the provisions written so that the shares being bought out, or they're being bought, and the money that you get for the shares does go to the spouse or goes to another family member versus going into the either the shareholder or the LLC member's estate. Because if it goes into their estate, if it's still considered their money, their sole money, and it's in their estate, then the heirs of the estate have to go through probate in order to get that money.
Right. So they're either going to have to wait a really long time to ever see that money, or it's going to go towards debts and liabilities of the estate, and they're never going to see the money at all at that
Exactly.
point. Now, how does it work if we go back to Neil's nationwide dry cleaning business? I have my partner, and we each have our spouses who don't do anything with the business. And let's say I am the top salesman and the top franchisee and the top operator of Neil's nationwide or dry cleaning business, and I die. That's going to cripple the business because I was the big guy doing all the stuff, and my other partner was, let's say, the finance guy behind it all, whatever, right? I'm gone. How do you protect the business if somebody did unexpectedly pass away? You had mentioned something to me, and I forget what it's called, which is why I'm asking. Is you said there's some sort of like an insurance that you can have that protects the business? Is that correct?
Yes, like key person insurance is a common term for it, but I cannot stress this enough. In pretty much in the scenario that you said exactly, and it happens in several other scenarios where there could be a handful of key employees or one key employee. Obviously, they could be owners, but they're working too for the business, right?
Yeah.
And this is where key person itself can take out an insurance policy on its top producers, the people who are really the earners for the company, keep the company afloat because of their position or because of what they do. And then this way, if they have this insurance policy in place, if something happens to that person, the insurance would serve to at least hopefully cover a year's worth of what that person could bring in, or several months, to buy the company some time to find a replacement or get them back on their feet. And it's a really, really, really good thing to have in place, especially when you consider that depending on contribute to the company, if something does happen to them, maybe, they end up dying, it could totally wipe out the entire business because we don't usually have somebody who can replace them at, the drop of a hat.
Yeah. Okay. So key person insurance is that the actual name of it, or?
Yeah, that is the actual name
Okay.
of it. And there's different types of policies. It's always best, of course, to speak to somebody who
sells the insurance
or sells insurance, specifically these types of policies. But it's not uncommon. You see it a lot in larger companies where it's a requirement that there's insurance policies taken out, at least on certain key executives or officers of the company. But I am a big fan of it, even for smaller businesses, maybe even especially for smaller businesses, because losing one person, that one key employee, or
that's crippling.
Yeah, totally crippling. It might disable the entire business.
So even if there's like a husband, spouse, small business, let's say, as I'm thinking about this, right? Me and my spouse, we have a small business. Let's say it's Neil's dry cleaning, but it's not the nationwide one. And I'm the one who does the majority of it, I could still have the key person insurance so that if something did happen, then the business would be able to have some money coming in from the insurance while my spouse is deciding, do I want to keep going? Am I going to sell the business, et cetera, et cetera?
Exactly, exactly. The business could take out a policy on you, and then in the event of your death, the policy would pay the business to at least keep the business afloat or keep it operational when all these other things are being worked out.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, good. So then I imagine that obviously, as we talked about, these are kind of the basics of the succession aspect of it. We've got our bank accounts, our beneficiaries, our payable on deaths, our key person insurances, making sure our agreements are in place. Now, obviously, that can be very different from business to business. And there's probably some things that are really, really simple to take care of, and there's probably ones that are a little bit more difficult. So I always recommend everybody to either meet with Ashly or meet with your own attorney, whatever it is, but make sure you're covered. But what would you say? Well, I guess I had a question. I realized we kind of answered it already, but I guess what would you say, Ashly, moving forward as we get near the end of the live stream here? What's the most important or first thing somebody should look at when they look at, do I have a succession plan in place, or where do they start?
So I think the very first thing that's, might seem almost too basic, but believe it or not, a lot of people can't answer this question easily. The very first thing is, who would you want to take over, right? Like if you're in this situation, what is your ideal scene, or what would you like to have happen? And, just really quickly, I can give you 5 common examples.
Yeah.
You could have a scenario where oftentimes, and maybe it's not even an owner, but you might have a manager or a very trusted employee who you've considered selling the business to, right? So that can be an option where that paperwork is in place or that idea is in place. If you're not around, obviously your spouse can help with that, but you could consider selling to either a co-owner or a manager or another employee. We talked about this one, Neil, as far as like passing it on to your heirs.
Yeah.
You want to determine who is it. Is it going to be your spouse? Is it going to be your kids? Your brother? Who wants the business? Who's going to take it over? And
Yeah.
then you can do a succession plan based off of that.
Okay.
The other thing that you might want to think about, and a lot of times people do this even as they're maybe getting older and thinking about retiring, there's a possibility of selling to outside parties, right? Especially if you know the value of your business, and an outside party might be able to give more, to contribute more, or you're going to get a higher, say, payout immediately than you would with maybe like a business plan with, or selling the business to an employee might be structured a little bit differently. So if there's a way to have written into your plan how to market the business or how to put it up for sale so that it's on the open market, and maybe potentially then it could go to the highest bidder. So there's that as an option too. And then the last one, which we kind of touched on as well, is if you do have multiple owners in the company, or you're one person who owns stock, or you're one member, there should be something in your agreements that discuss selling your shares or selling your membership units back to the company.
Okay. So these are all basic things that can be drafted and put together somewhat reasonably commonly, or reasonably, let's say, time wise. It's not like this is all going to take years to put together. I think most people, when they think of like estate or estate planning, or I mean, I had this idea before you and I met, estate planning and wills and business ideas, I thought that it was this like big nebulous time consuming thing, and then you realize it's actually pretty straightforward and it's pretty standard. Don't be,
Yeah.
what I guess I'm trying to say is, from my own experience to other people, is don't be scared to look into how do you do this. And if you do end up paying an attorney for a few hours of their time, it's a lot cheaper to do that than to lose a family business, or to lose a checking account that you didn't have a name on, or to lose a checking account that didn't have a beneficiary listed to it, and never be able to have access to it again. It's really something that I found the value of in the last year, unfortunately. But at the same time, I realized it was just something that people don't talk about a lot. People don't talk about, hey, how's it set up if your partner dies and he's the one who makes all the money, and you're out on your yacht, and what happens the next day? Nobody really
Yeah.
thinks of those types of things. And then, you know, the stock certificate and the wording of everything and making sure it's good. These are the types of things that a business has to have, because if a key partner did pass on, the business after that is worth almost nothing if it's not helped out for that first year, or it doesn't have that key person insurance. These are all like really easy, basic things that you can do. Now, let's say, I know a lot of people here in the Clearwater area, business owners of mine or friends of mine, that aren't necessarily like running a brick and mortar business, but let's say they work for another company or they work for a large group and they're kind of like an independent contractor of a large company or something like that, right? Let's say I sell insurance or I sell supplements and vitamins or whatever. If I were to pass on at that point, is there a way of keeping that to a spouse, do you know? Like any future income that might be owed to me, the independent contractor, is that able to be passed on?
Absolutely. And there's, a few different clauses that can be added into the service provider or independent contractor agreement, whatever agreement that you have in place.
Yep.
There are clauses that can be added to it so that in the event that something does happen to you, any future payments that you're owed under that contract or any royalties or commissions or whatever it might be can then be payable directly to your spouse or your heirs or whatever you negotiate and have set up in your agreement,
Okay.
so that it isn't just like death terminates the agreement and there's no more liability for either side, because obviously that wouldn't be fair in all the instances, especially if you did all the work. That money should be able to be
Yeah,
passed
like a
on
a
to your
lot of
spouse.
contractors get paid on projects, 6 months or a year
Oh yeah,
later or whatever it is. If you pass on, I mean, there could be thousands of dollars left on the table for a family if you didn't, or maybe you've got residuals that come in off of policies
exactly.
and things that you sell that you get paid, a little bit here and there on, but over a year it builds up. And, if that were to stop, then, you would basically be losing the income that you're owed at that point.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised how many people don't check for these things in their agreements before they sign them, because you're not always necessarily thinking with it.
Mhm.
But yeah, it does happen where there are contracts with residual payments, royalties, or just contracts because of the nature of the work. The payout is staggered or occurs over time, or it occurs later in time. And
Yeah.
if something happens and there's no account for what happens to that money after you pass away, the other side might not have any legal liability to pay anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that was a thought that I had just while we were talking. Like, well, what about these like independent guys that not getting paid? That would definitely, probably a lot of people fall into that category. Now, let's say I already have an agreement with a company and I want to make that change. Is that something that you think a company would be willing to change if I said, "Hey, I want to make sure that if something happened to me, my spouse gets this," or do they usually not worry about that kind of stuff?
It really depends on the company. Ideally, that's something that you would have negotiated on the front end. It's always easiest to just negotiate that term and get it in there on the front end.
Yep.
However, if you're very valuable to this company and they like you a lot, it really is the right thing to do. And it shouldn't be that big of a deal for them to agree to an amendment to the agreement. And it would just be adding some language into the already executed agreement, after the fact. However, you could also be in a situation where a company said, no, sorry, you signed the agreement as is, take it or leave it. But I would hope that most companies, especially if the service that you're providing to them is valuable to them, would consider that type of an amendment.
Yeah, I would assume most would. I wasn't sure if that was normal or not. So, but it's probably not too common that people ask about that kind of stuff because they probably don't think about it. So, who knows? Awesome. Well, Ashley, I really appreciate you coming on. I'm just to tell everybody watching again, this is Ashly Guernaccini with At Cause Law. You saw her website pop up down below. She is here in Florida, but whether you want to work with Ashley or you have another attorney wherever it is that you are, feel free to reach out to them. But I use Ashley for everything that I need business related. She's awesome and local, and she gave us her time here today. So I want to really thank you for your time here today, Ashley. And anybody else watching on the delay, if you have any questions or other topics that you'd like me to have Ashley come in on, we will bring her back and we will do another whether it's business succession or copywriting, trademarks. We didn't even talk about trusts and all that type of pour over. What is the word you use? Pour over trust? Is that the other one?
Oh, pour over will. Yeah,
Pour over
that's
wills.
it
Yeah.
goes along with the trust, or it can go along with the trust.
Yeah, so maybe the next one's going to be all about pour over wills and regular wills and trusts and all kinds of other stuff. But what we talked about here today are some basic things that anybody can really do to protect themselves. And if you need legal advice, go talk to an attorney. Again, I recommend Ashly, obviously, but go talk to an attorney and get yourself covered, because I know from personal experience that if one box is not checked properly on a form, or one word, which could mean 12 things, is used, then somebody is going to try and interpret it differently. So you want to make sure it's perfectly clear and easy to save yourself and your family a lot of drama and all kinds of legal and attorney fees later on. So thanks again, Ashly, for coming on. Hopefully next time the dogs can come in and say hello, but I know they get a little rambunctious. And we will see you all next time. Leave your comments down below. And if you have any questions, we'll bring Ashly on and we will talk about it then. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.